Hello everybody and welcome back to another Hellbound Garage. Today is going to be all about lists. Fact of the matter is there's an event that I want to go to with the Datsun running that is upon us. It's within like 2 months of this video, and well, I am a long way from having this car running and driving. So the plan is to at least to get the car running and idling, and worst case scenario, trailer it to where I want to go, but I want to get it running. If the engine does not idle, then there's no point in taking it, and I will just go to the event without my car, but I'm kind of tired of going to events without it. So that is where lists come into play. Now, I happen to have 2 lists. This list, as the car goes back together, those are things that I still need to do as I'm putting things back in the car. And the list behind me, this big one here, well, this list was the original list as I was tearing down the car and starting to reassemble it and do things like undercoating, as the title says. But because of how everything is going, there are certain things on this list that didn't have to be done right as the car was being torn down or painted. Like, you can see some of the stuff says during reassembly. Well, we're in reassembly, so we're going to go through all the things that still need to happen. We'll either add to the list that we already have or start checking things off. Let's start going through this list. So at the time of this video, the switch panel, I know this is all flipped, I'm sorry. The switch panel mount, which is in the dash, will be done. Next thing is going to be bulkhead to starter, starter to alternator, and bulkhead to ground block. It's gonna be a little chaotic in here, but right back there are 2 bulkheads, and they go down and they go across to the alternator, to the ground block, to the back of the head, and to the front of the head to this ground block. On anything electrical, the more ground you have, the better chance you have of everything working properly. Doesn't matter if it's carbureted V8 or a turbo Honda Civic. More ground, the better. So we can mark that one off our list. Now, the one we can't mark off on the list is going to be the grounds for the switch panel, taillights, fuse panel, and engine. Those I will have to get to. They're not going to be in a video because they're not very interesting at all, but they're not done, so they got to stay on the list. This list will be condensed into another panel, cardboard panel, to get rid of all this crossed out stuff. The only other thing on this list is I do have up here engines. The engine harness needs to be wrapped, but I want to start the engine itself, make sure that everything is good before I then wrap everything up and have to unwrap it if something's wrong. The next big one on this list that I've actually been working on and is almost finished is going to be the fan shroud. Alright, so this is my radiator fan shroud and radiator fans. Don't ask me where I got the radiator fans. I bought these things like 5 or 6 years ago. I think it's off Amazon or something. I don't remember. If they ever die, I'll have to upgrade. But this is the fan shroud. Now I feel like, why does that look interesting, or why does that look familiar? And well, that is because, let me slide this out. It is 2 cookie sheets. Yeah, I saw this back in the forums way back in the day when forums were still really a thing. Now that they're kind of dying, that another Z enthusiast found out that you take a couple of cookie sheets and you can mold them together, cut some stuff off of them, and make a radiator fan shroud. Now, altogether, I have $10, $15 into this deal. The cost of the cookie sheets, and then because they do have edges that I'm not necessarily fond of, do have some hose that I'm putting around the edge. It'll help seal the shroud to the radiator, as well as it'll make sure that none of the vibration cuts into the aluminum of the radiator. Now, if you like finding cheap solutions like this to expensive problems, well, this is just two 11x17 cookie sheets from the dollar store, and they fit perfectly with a factory style Datsun 280Z. And that is how I made a $400 part, depending on where you buy it from, for $10. Because we're going over it, this is a 3-row, 3-core, however you want to call it, radiator for a 280Z. I bought it off of eBay 5 years ago. But besides being a little beat up from being stored, this is pretty much brand new because it's got, well, less than 1,000 miles on it between the L28, the small block, and everything else. So we're going to keep running it until it blows. Now, the very trick parts on this are that guy. This isn't a sponsored video, but it's a pretty cool product that I found, and it's made by a company called Autoplumb. Pretty awesome. It allows you to take any factory style radiator and essentially put AN fittings on it without having to weld them on. Downside to these really cool parts is they are pretty expensive. I quite honestly have more in the two fittings attached to the radiator than what I do on the radiator, probably the fans and the shroud. So, you know, one of those things I really wanted cool parts, and well, you pay cool parts. So I'm gonna get this mess all cleaned up, painted, reassembled, back in the car, and we'll move on to the next thing.
A little later.
Looks pretty good, right? If you're wondering, the radiator support in my car was one of the areas that had seen a lot of abuse, which is why I now have the setup that I do. I used Heim joints because originally I wanted that whole adjustable, but I couldn't figure out a way to mount the radiator to the bar without taking away the adjustment, so I ended up with that. Either way, looks good, holds it in place, and I can officially call that one done. Which means I can come over here and on the fan shroud, cross that off. Which brings me to the next part of the cooling system and the next thing on the list, and that is the Dash 20 AN coolant lines. This is one of the times that I made my life way harder than it needs to be, so let me show you. Small block Chevys are one of the absolute easiest things in the world to work on, hands down. Very simple, very mechanical. But when you do things like add an electric water pump, lower the alternator, add custom AN lines to your radiator, cut your radiator support off and lower it as much as possible with an all new mount, you end up causing problems. And that problem happens to be right there. So that line, or that fitting, has to connect into what's back here for the water pump. But there's a sway bar in the way. This originally was not a problem. The last time that this car was together and running, I had this alternator bracket on the car. So this is key point number one of why this is so much harder. If you look where the alternator is now, it actually used to sit about there, somewhere in there. See how much higher it sits over the factory location, or the now location? That is probably the single biggest change when it comes to now being an issue. The second problem is the radiator now sits a tidge bit lower than what it did from the factory stuff, just because of how everything was fabricated. And then the third thing is this fitting. So you don't realize how much more length is from there to there because of going with these special fittings, where had I used the factory hose, the factory hose connects right there. So all this is added length that didn't used to be there. So I used to be able to just run 2 of these, I don't know, accordion style radiator hoses, and it cleared everything. It was great. But I had to go and make my life so much harder by doing all these things, and then adding in the fact that I'm going with the special AN lines for the coolant, and it's kind of blown out of proportion, and it's made a bit of a mess of things. So this is how we are going to fix it, or this is how I already fixed it. So the company, this Auto Plumb, they actually provide templates for each of the style fittings that they sell or they have access to, and they give you this so you can mock up how your coolant system is supposed to go. Because as much as they're custom parts, they realize just how expensive all this stuff is, and they specifically say to use this stuff so that way they don't have to deal with costly returns or the fact that you're out of pocket more money than you would have if you didn't have access to these simple tools. So you simply go onto their website and you print these out, make sure that they're the actual size, and then you can use them on your fittings here, and they simply go like that, and then you can kind of tell if that fitting matches to where you gotta go. Super cool that the company actually does this for you. At the end of the day, you know, these fittings are anywhere from $40 to $60 a piece, at least the ones that I'm purchasing, and it just adds up really quick. So it's nice that the company does that. I have gone ahead and I've already figured out what fittings I need and how much hose that I need, and I've ordered that. So hopefully it gets here soon, but until then we'll move on to the next thing. Alright, so the next thing that is on this big old list is hood pin mounting. I am not worried about this because this does not affect how the car runs, but I do have arrow catch flush mounted latches because I'm a sucker for them. I love the way they look, very race car-y. As much as the button ones are much simpler and just as safe, I still like the arrow catch ones so much better. Okay, so all this stuff is done. Then we get down to here on this list. So the passenger seat, I can worry about that after the car is running. Harness mounting, I do have to worry about that if I want to drive the car on the street, but it's not affected for the car running. Same with body plugs. I do have something else to go along with that, so I'm not going to worry about that now. And there is this. There is super minor rear quarter panel rust right there. And it's a couple of spots. I dropped the car as I was lowering it a few videos back, so that's what the scuff marks are. Luckily, I got to fix the rust, so not really that mad about dropping the car and damaging that part a little more. But for now, once again, it doesn't affect how the car runs or drives, so I'm not going to worry about it. Plus, I have something cool that I kind of want to do for the backside of the car, so that whole thing is up in the air for now. I will be getting rid of the big list and condensing it down to a smaller one, but this is the next list that I started to create as I started to put the car back together, things I was missing, things I need to change. And I think the last thing that we are going to do in this video, unless my coolant stuff shows up before I finish, is we're going to take care of this issue right here, this bleed clutch. Now, in a few videos back, I installed and explained my clutch situation for the T5. It uses a stock Camaro slave cylinder, uses a Willwood master cylinder, and then is connected by a -4 AN braided line with a special fitting that goes into the Camaro slave cylinder, because the Camaro slave cylinder originally is fed with a plastic line and a special clip. This fitting you then can put into that hole of the slave cylinder and adapt it to an AN line so you can put it in any vehicle. Problem is, I have had multiple of these fittings leak after installing because all they're secured by is a pin. So they've got a little play in them, and if they move just right or they're not machined perfectly, they start to leak. Well, the one that was not leaking when I took this car apart is now leaking, and I'm tired of dealing with this problem. I don't want to be at a track day and have it end my track day because of a leaking clutch line. Screw that. No thank you. So I bought a new product, what is hopefully going to be the solution to all my problems, and that is this guy. Let me flip you around. This is a billet slave cylinder for a T5 or T56, depending on how you route the T56, sold by Race Tuning. I have never heard of this company, but as I was searching for a solution for a slave cylinder, this is what I came up with. This is the only thing that had a built-in AN line fitting, meaning no special fitting, none of that jazz. It goes straight into the body with an AN fitting. No more leaks at the fitting, unless of course it's loose. I'm guessing the way that this is built, they do it so they can universally use parts through other transmissions, which is kind of cool. But this is what comes in this kit. So you've got the mount and the slave cylinder. This is what they're calling a quick bleed system, and it actually has full instructions on how to bleed the slave cylinder after it's installed, and I guess this feeds directly back into your master cylinder reservoir, making this a very clean and simple process. I'm going to get this installed. Problem is, it's in a really tight space, so I'm not going to have any video to show you because that sucker is right down in there. Right there. It's easy to do because it's only 2 bolts, but it's also hard to do because it's in a tight space. So I'm going to get that installed. I'm not going to be able to test it or anything like that because, well, the car's not running, but it'll be one more thing off the list. This is just a side-by-side comparison. Looks like factory-wise, or how they send it to you, ends up being the right length push rod. This is adjustable, so you can kind of move it in or out, but right there is pretty much perfect. The part that confused me was these instructions here. As you go through, it talks about the bleeder and picking the right bleeder and whatnot. And I know that this cap comes off, but what I didn't realize is that this whole deal is actually 2 pieces. So you can pop that off, and that becomes your bleeder instead of having a screw cap, if that's what you decide, which is going to be the way that I'm going to go. But anyways, I'm going to get this installed in the car. Well, I got it installed, but once again, I ran into another problem. Really wasn't expecting. Let me show you. Alright, so it's tight in here. So hopefully you can see it. There you go. Alright, sorry it's blurry. Don't mind the old oil filter. That's just been on there for storage. But here is the slave cylinder installed. Easy peasy. Bleeder is on the bottom. Fitting is on the top. Problem is, where is it at? Right there is my line to go to there. Well, it's short by 190-degree angle. And that's because, well, on the stock slave cylinder, the fitting sits on top, and this one, it sits on the side. One more thing I gotta order. Yay. Well, it's a new day. Yesterday, after fighting the coolant system and fighting the clutch system, sat here and stared at the car and I'm like, what can I do? What can I do to progress this car further? And staring me in the face was the steering shaft. I'm like, cool. Put that back in the car. No money needs to be spent, blah, blah, blah. And, well, that's not the case. We'll try and show it the best we can. Right now, I have the steering rack loosened up so I can pivot because I had to get that joint back onto the steering rack, which is no problem. and then it goes through over here, past the header, and into this coupler. That hasn't been an issue. There's always been clearance there. It's been no problem whatsoever. But this is the first time that I've had the car fully assembled with headers and everything since I changed to the angle plug small block Chevy cylinder heads. And something between the angled headers and the straight plug headers has made it so now the steering shaft doesn't want to go into its home. So now I have to take apart a bunch of stuff on the driver's side to be able to get the header out, to take a hammer to my new header that I wrapped, which I don't have to spend money on it, but I have to beat up my brand new parts that should have fit. But anyways, let me get you set up and we'll get this torn apart. It is really tight under here, so I'm going to try and show you the best that I can. Went ahead and reconnected the steering shaft correctly after removing the header. I also removed the wrap from the two outside runners. And if you can't see right there on the steering shaft, those little marks, that is where the header is hitting. Just that little bit there. But this means a couple of things. First thing that this means is that I will not be able to wrap the header the way that I had it before. Before I had it as far as possible down the collector to hold as much heat into that little header as possible. Now I'm going to have to cut it short to make sure that the wrap and the clamps don't get in the way of the steering shaft, which is no big deal. The second thing is I am going to have to smack that. And the thing is where it's rubbing right now is where the weld connects the collector and the header, or the runner for cylinder 1, I think. So I'm gonna have to smack that. And the problem is that's a thick area on the header, so we'll see what actually happens if I crack it, if I gotta cut it and weld a piece into it. At the end of the day, I think they cost me like $140, so if I have to get a new set, no big deal, but I'd rather not. Let's get this header back out of the car and start smacking it for clearance. Okay, well, it's hasn't been a single try on that. Because it's a repetitive process after the first try, I just turned off the camera and went to town on this thing, and I am absolutely filthy and disgusting, and it is hot as heck out here and humid. Not to mention we are dealing with the whole smoke in the atmosphere killing everybody's lungs. But I finally got it fitted. I got enough clearance that I think I'm okay, even if things expand a little bit. If I put the exhaust on and the exhaust is heavy enough that it moves it enough to hit the steering rod, then I will go back to it after the fact. But as far as I know, it is good to go. So let me show you something here. So this is the new header that I have royally beat the heck out of. Originally I started with this DOM tubing that was left over from the cage because I only built half of it. But after the third or fourth try, I got really tired of it not taking the shape that I wanted, so I went to this. Use what you got, right? So it's a 1/2 inch impact extension, and I just beat this with a hammer on here. So I kind of kept it round and didn't break anything, but got a tighter shape. Interesting enough, though, is this guy here. So I did not realize this. On top of the fact that the runners from the outside going in, and then the middle going to the backside, unlike these ones, because of these being straight, they don't have to have the extra clearance. So these outside runners go to the inside, if that makes any sense. Besides that being a difference, didn't notice, but if you can see here, terrible lighting, this is about 42-43 mil, and I don't know if you're going to be able to see that or not. There's a gap right there, see it? Which means that these runners on these shorty headers, or these block hugger headers, are actually a bigger diameter than the ones that I had before. Not by much, but it's still enough of a difference, and so the difference in the pattern of the header plus the extra size of the header made for all the clearance problems. Wouldn't have known until I got everything back together, so it's been a giant pain. I'm going to let that cool down because it is still really hot. Rewrap the header as best as I can without going to the area that contacts the steering rod, and get that back in the car, and then we'll go on to the next thing.
72 hours later.
Okay, well, it's been a few days, and as you can tell, the car is back down on the ground. I apologize, but I had family in town, and they spent time out here in the garage while I was working, and it just felt awkward to try and video any of that, so I didn't. But I got quite a bit done. It may or may not seem like that on video, but let me explain. The most important thing is I got the header back in. It clears the steering shaft down there by a very small margin. I got the exhaust all hooked back up. I'm definitely gonna have to do some kind of a bracket underneath the car to get everything solved with the exhaust issue, and to fix the binding problem I was having. I ended up cutting the middle bracket. I don't know if I've said anything about that. That actually held both pipes together because this is duals all the way back. And in doing that, it fixed the binding problem, but then it also allowed the weight difference to kind of swing wherever it wants to, and I think with heat and time it's actually going to bend the header back into the steering shaft, so I need to come up with a bracket for that, but for the moment it's okay. Along with that, for the exhaust, I got the O2 sensor run for the fuel injection. I don't know if you can tell, but that wire right there, there's a factory hole
that I had covered up with heat shielding that I drilled through and ran the cable just because it made the most sense. The O2 sensor is somewhere under here and is a super short routing. That was another big thing on my list because I can't start the car and have it run any kind of decent way without the O2 sensor. The other thing that I got done, and it's not gonna seem very interesting, it's not gonna seem very big and monumental, but I got all the wiring done. The only thing that's left wiring wise is the radiator fans, which is super simple, and the turn signals, because this is a 280Z, but I have 240Z turn signals that I really want to use. I just like them way better. So that's it for wiring, and this car's done. I'm so happy. And the last thing that I have been working on, but haven't gotten anywhere with it, is still the cooling system. And well, that is because this stuff came in, and using the templates here, these guys down here, I thought I had this all figured out. I thought I could get it here, cut everything down to size, get it installed, and I would have no problems. But something happened. Something that without two people I couldn't really figure out. And that is the water pump neck to the steering rack clearance problem. So I've been having a really hard time going from the water pump around the alternator, around the rack, and to this fitting on the bottom. I ordered another fitting. Hopefully that solves the problem. Instead of a straight or a 90, I actually got a 30-degree version of this, and hopefully that fixes everything, because I'm really tired of buying these fittings. Alright, well, obviously I don't have a coolant AN fitting in my hand, and that's because, well, it's been a few days and it hasn't come in. It doesn't help that at the time of this video there was a holiday in the middle of the week, as well as I got a text message from the company because they found out that the distributor of the parts they sell didn't have the black version of the fitting, and because I did not want to wait that long, because it was going to be a 2 or 3 week wait, I had decided to say screw it and have them send me a silver fitting, which they did have in stock. It's going to be hidden next to the water pump on the engine block, so you're not really going to see it, and it's something that after I'm done spending a bunch of money, I can go back and replace. But for the time being, I'm trying to get this car done. So we're on to this. Now, if you've never seen one of these before, you may have seen one of these. And well, if you haven't seen one of these before, you may count yourself lucky, or you just pay to have it done, or you're not into race cars. Don't know. Anyways, this is a one-man brake bleed kit. It's got a one-way check valve on the top. You put fluid in here so it doesn't somehow suck up air back into the brake lines, and then this goes into the fitting onto your caliper, and that's how you bleed your brakes. But because this is a completely fresh brake system with zero fluid in it, and it's just going to take a lot of effort for one person to do that, I went out and bought one of these guys. I used to use these a lot when I worked at a quick lube shop where we did brakes and minor mechanic work, and this is a vacuum bleeder. So instead of having to pump the brakes to get the fluid to work its way down the lines and into the calipers, this actually sucks the air out of the system, sucking the brake fluid down into each caliper, and then you can treat it like a normal brake flush or a brake fluid exchange. That being said, I'm not entirely sure how this is gonna honestly work, because on top of this being a completely empty system, I now have the adjustable, wow, words are hard. I'll put it here. And with that, plus the bigger master cylinder and everything else, this could take a while. Normally you bench bleed the master cylinder and everything else, but I didn't in this case. And so yeah, this could take a while. So I'm going to get it set up as a time lapse and just work my way through it as we're sitting here still waiting for this fitting.
The brake system went way smoother than I thought it was. I did end up chasing a couple of really minor leaks, things that I thought were going to be way worse than what they actually were, because they are the first time that I've created a double flare fitting. But surprisingly, everything went well. The proportioning valve, which is the word that I didn't know earlier for whatever reason, it skipped my brain, was where all the leaks occurred, which was no surprise, honestly. But the vacuum bleeder worked for a certain extent. I still ended up having to use this guy right here. So this is the one-man brake bleeder. As you can see how it's set up, you've got the bleeder with the nozzle going into the bottle. The bottle, you're supposed to have a little bit of fluid in it. That way it doesn't suck air back into the line on accident. And then you pump the brakes and it keeps new air from getting into the system. And you watch this line, you can kind of see like right here. I only set this up after the fact, so that's why it's got air bubbles in it. But you can actually watch the air bubbles travel through this tube into this container. And once you see 0 bubbles in that tube, that means this line is bled. If you have never actually used one before, that's how simple they are. They are a lifesaver. Instead of having 2 people, one crack open the bleeders, pump, the other person pump the brakes, blah, blah, blah. One-man brake bleeder, definitely the way to go. Now, the other thing, of course I did that, if you need new clips for your brake lines, or if you're a BC coilover guy with stainless braided lines like me, and maybe any aftermarket application, this number right here, it's reverse, is the number for the brake hose retaining clips to keep the lines attached to the coilovers instead of flopping around. I did not know that. The guy gave them to me in AutoZone, and definitely a lifesaver on that one. At this point, I think I'm waiting on the fitting for the cooling system once again, and doing the stuff for the ECU. And then I get to start the car. So I think I'm gonna call this video done, just because I kind of ran out of stuff to do. My garage is an absolute disaster, so I am going to clean up the shop and go enjoy a little bit of time inside, which I haven't done much of lately. Anyways, thank you for watching. Thank you for your support. Until the next one.